Hi, this is Fritjiof Dahlgaard, and in this video I am going to talk about how to study a score when you are preparing for conducting it. I am going to go through the basics of a specific method which was taught to me by Jorma Panula. It's a method that sets out some good general guidelines for how to approach a score when you are getting to know it. So let's get right to it. The central element in this method is that most of the work you do is simply reading through the music in tempo. And this is the way you should start out also. So when you take out a new score for the first time, you simply open it and start reading a large section, maybe as much as one full movement. Because by doing so, you get used to the tempo and you get to understand the overall form of the piece, and that's a very good place to start. If you start out by trying to play something on an instrument, then you will most likely have to play it much slower than the way it's going to be performed, and therefore you will get used to a much slower tempo from the beginning. Whereas if you start out by reading through the music, you can simply read in tempo and you will get used to the tempo, and then later on if you play something and you try to work out the harmonies and all these things, then that will not disturb you from understanding the real tempo, because you will have already established the real tempo before when you were reading through. So that's the main point of the whole method. Read through the music as much as possible, without listening to anything, without playing anything on an instrument, just read it. And then you may be able to hear the music in your head as you're reading it, and if you are, then good for you. That's a good bonus to have. But also, if you're not able to hear it in your head, that doesn't matter. You should still read it through like this, because there are lots of things that you will still be able to notice. For instance, you can notice when different sections begin and end. You can notice when different instrument groups are playing and which instrument groups aren't playing. You can notice when there are big orchestral crescendos and diminuendos. You can notice when there are solos and when there are tutti passages. There are lots of things that you're able to observe as you read through, even if you can't hear it yet. So as you read through, you get used to what's going on at the different sections of the piece, and then when you've gone through a full movement, you should have a more or less clear picture of what is happening where. Then the next step is that you read through the whole thing once again, and you notice which things you remember from the first time you read it through, and you also notice new things the second time that you're going through it. And by doing so, you keep strengthening your relationship with the music. Then later on, you might sit down at the piano, for instance, or with some violin or whichever is your instrument, and play some things from the score. It's a very good idea to do this also, because it's helpful to understand how the harmonies progress. And also, by doing something, by physically doing something, which you do when you play on an instrument, you also memorize the music more easily than if it's just reading. Reading is good for getting an overview, but it's also quite abstract. And it's very helpful if you have played already on your instrument certain harmonic progressions. Then as they come at a rehearsal when you're conducting it, you'll remember them much more easily, and you'll remember exactly how the music is changing, because you remember the physical sensation of having played it. Some of you may be inclined to think that it's going to be useful for you if you listen to a recording as you study. But that's probably the worst thing you can possibly do, because by doing so you get to look at the music through someone else's eyes, so to say, through someone else's ears. You get used to the music by hearing how someone else is performing it. And that's not a very good idea, because no matter what, it is going to affect the way that you look at the music. Panula is categorically against ever listening to other people's recordings. And I must say that personally, I think that it's not something that you should do if you're going to perform a piece yourself and you're going to prepare for it. But still, it is to some extent useful to listen to what other people are doing, because you will notice things that you wouldn't have noticed yourself, or you will hear some way of phrasing or some way of connecting different things which you wouldn't have thought of yourself, and it's very useful to get some outside impressions, obviously. But the problem is that if you only listen to the same recording of a piece, then you will get very much stuck with all the ideas from that recording. So if you're going to listen to recordings, then you should listen to as many different ones as possible. And you should maybe even listen to recordings that you don't particularly like, because they're still going to give you some ideas, and they're still going to break you away from what you are used to hearing from the recordings that you do like. And you may hear some details in them that you find out that you actually quite like anyway. But the main point is that you should not listen to what other people are doing when you are trying to figure out what to do yourself. And whenever you are reading through a movement, like I have described, you should never do it with a recording. You should always only do it yourself, reading through yourself, getting to know the music yourself, imagining it yourself. Don't allow your mind to be polluted by other people's ideas. Only allow it to develop its own, and then take inspiration a little bit once in a while, if you need. So let's have a look at a concrete example. This is the first symphony by Sibelius, the first page. So let's imagine you're going to conduct this piece, and you open it, and you're going to start reading. So you start out by noticing what instruments are going to play. This is something that Panula compares to going to a restaurant and checking out the menu. You have a look at what's available. So you notice that there are 2 of each woodwinds. There's no piccolo or contrabassoon or anything else. There's just 2 of each woodwinds. Then there are 4 horns, and there are 3 trumpets and trombones, 3 and a tuba. There's a harp and timpani, and we have bass drum and cymbals, and then there's the string section. So now you know what instruments are involved. And then you can see here from the accidentals that the score is transposed. And you should be aware of that, and you should be aware of what the instruments are transposing into. So the clarinet's in A, and the horns are in F as usual, but the trumpets are also in F. And this is important to pay attention to, because if you're going to try to understand something about the harmonies along the way, then you must be aware of the fact that these instruments are going to be transposed. Then the next thing is that you notice the key. There's 1 sharp, and it says E minor. So the symphony is in E minor, and you notice what the time signature is, alla breve. So there are 2 beats in the bar, and it's possible that you might do it in 4 if it's going to be quite slow. It says andante ma non troppo, so it's in a walking tempo but not too much, which probably means that it's going to be relatively slow but not too slow. And then now you have understood enough from this beginning to actually start reading it. So what you do is you pick a tempo that you think fits, and then you stick to that tempo as you read through. Then when you have read through it, you might find that actually, oh, this tempo was probably a bit too slow or a bit too fast. You will know that once you have gone through some of these different places with their different rhythms. You will be able to feel if it is too slow, if it is too fast. And then you go back and read it again and change the tempo. But don't change the tempo on the way. Pick a tempo and stick with it, and then change it later when you read through again. Because that way you will establish a good relationship with the tempo by keeping it consistent. And that way you will also notice what feels more natural to you, what kind of tempo feels more natural to you, by being consistent with the one you have picked, even if it turns out to be one that doesn't fit you very well. And then you simply start reading, and you read all the way through the first movement. Of course, if the score clearly indicates a metronome marking, you should try out reading it in the tempo that the metronome marking indicates. But as you can see in this score, there is only a tempo indication but no metronome mark. And as a matter of fact, there are some metronome markings in the preface to this score which show which metronome markings have been used in different editions, and they differ quite a lot from each other. And when you have situations like this, where it isn't completely clear what tempo was wanted by the composer, then you should try out different ones. You can try out something closer to the slower one, closer to the faster one, and you might find something somewhere in between. But also you should know what kind of relationship the composer had with tempo, because if the composer wanted to have a very specific tempo and indicated it very specifically, then you should adhere to that more than if you're dealing with a composer who didn't really bother so much if things were in a very specific tempo. But then, since there's nothing indicated here, then you can just start out reading in a tempo that you pick. As you can see here, already on the next page, there's a tempo change. Suddenly the new tempo is allegro energico. And when you're reading, if you don't know the piece yet, you start reading and there's a tempo change, don't stop to figure out what would be the perfect tempo change. Try to just find the new tempo. Try to find it from the instruction and look at what kind of texture is to be produced. You can see there are these fast eighth notes by the second violins. And they give you an idea of what kind of tempo it should be. So you just transfer into the new tempo and start reading on in the new tempo. You can always go back again later and try it again in a different tempo if you have discovered on the way that the tempo that you picked does not suit you. But don't stop. Don't stop and try to figure out what would be an ideal tempo. Just read and read. Get to understand the overall form. Then let's assume that you are just reading on, and this is still the first time that you're going through the score. Some of the things you might notice as you go along is you'll notice that there are these very rapid movements that go into the next first beat of the next bar. And here they stop. So here there's a change in the texture. Now it's full, long notes, and no longer these shorter things. So you try to imagine what that sounds like, at least rhythmically, even if you cannot hear the harmonies in your head. Just try to imagine how this is going to proceed rhythmically. You're still going through it first time. You probably notice as you go along that there are these fast figures here, and you move on and you notice some more, and you notice some more, and you notice some more as you go along. Then you read on and you read to the end of the movement, and then when you go through the second time, then when you come over here, then you notice, oh yeah, I remember this short thing here, and I remember this figure here. So if you remember that, then you don't look at it again, you try to look at something else. Okay, there's this tremolo here. Is it going to be metric or not? You can wonder about that as you go along, but you still keep the tempo. You notice that, oh, the double bass is playing a pizzicato here. You didn't notice that before. And then you go on. And then maybe you go on to playing some of this, trying to work out the harmonies, and then you go through and read it again. And then this time when you read it, you discover, because again, you remember this and you remember this now from before, so you don't look at that again. You just keep in your mind where it is, and you try to pay attention to something else along the way. And you notice that the third and first horns and the two bassoons and the oboes, they come in with long notes, with crescendo here on this second beat of this bar. Okay, so you try to put that into your mind. Try to understand how that is going to fit together with this that begins on the first beat of this bar and that goes over to these fast motifs. How is that going to all fit together, that these instruments come in here? And will you need to tell them at the rehearsal to play louder or to tell the other ones to play softer so they can be heard? You can start considering these things now that you're going through it for the third time. Maybe you can consider them before also, but it's always good to not wonder too much too early, because what you want to do from the beginning is just to get a natural idea of how the music is flowing, and you can always start wondering about these details later on. You notice that, oh, these things actually come in once again. Or maybe you notice that over here the flute is playing along with this motive that the trumpets are also playing. And then, as it continues, the clarinets are also playing along, but they weren't playing along over here. All these details will become apparent to you more and more as you go along. You will notice that the timpani is playing this tremolo, and then suddenly it plays 3 punched out notes together with these 3 notes in the horns and oboes. And how is all that going to fit into the musical flow? The more you read through, and the more you will naturally absorb what is going to happen. And you can always go in between your readings, you can go to an instrument and work out what's happening harmonically, so that it's easier for you to imagine how all of this is going to sound as you read through it again. Be aware of details also. Be aware of what is actually written in the music. For instance, here we have gone from one very loud section into a much softer section here with little flutes playing, and all of this is developed over the next page. And you may have a favorite recording, for instance, that you've heard many times already before you're going to study this, where the conductor has decided to take this in a slower tempo than this. But don't fall for these things when you're going to study it yourself. Actually, pay attention to what's written. There's no change in tempo here, for instance. So you should still be aware when you go through that when you're reading this, you should have kept the same tempo that you had when you were over here, because the composer didn't indicate any change. So try to keep it. Try to keep it already the first time that you're reading through the score, so that you make sure that you get a good habit of how to read things. Another good thing to do as you are preparing this is to go through the score looking at the dynamics that are being used. Also because that's one of those things that you are responsible for as the conductor. That's the things that you're going to show, and it's the things that you're going to balance at rehearsals to make sure that everything comes out clearly. So go through the score also looking at that. That's one of those central aspects of your conducting. What kind of dynamics are being used? Pay attention to when the loudest dynamic is. When is forte written and when is fortissimo written? And is there even a triple forte anywhere? If so, that's going to be the loudest place in the whole movement or in the whole piece. When is it pianissimo? Is there any place which is pianissimo? All of those things. Make yourself aware of it. You could maybe even sort of draw a picture in your mind of when are the loud places and when are the soft places, and when is this loudest place and how long is it going to stretch? How much of the movement is this loud passage going to take up? And how quickly does it get down to a soft dynamic? Give yourself a good overview of that, because if that gets strongly implanted in your mind together with all the ideas of what's happening where, then it's going to be more easy for you to actually produce that naturally in the rehearsal situation. You will notice immediately if something is being too loud, because you've already concentrated on attaching how loud something is going to be to your understanding of what it actually is that is going on. Also compare. If you have a passage which is similar to a passage early on in the piece, compare if it's going to be the same dynamics. Also if it's going to be the same instruments, but you're more likely to notice that automatically. But if it's going to be different dynamics, then how are they different? Is there a piano in the exposition but mezzo piano in the reprise, for instance? Or actually, is it piano in the reprise but forte in the exposition, or the other way around? If it's little differences, like if it's piano or pianissimo, then you might be likely to think, oh, but maybe the composer just didn't really think about it and just put piano one place and pianissimo the other place. Yeah, maybe, but still you have to think about it, because it could mean that there actually should be a difference. That actually the second time something comes around, it should be much softer. And if you're not noticing things like that, then you're missing on details that could be very important for the experience of the music as a whole. Here's an example of tempo-related things to be aware of when they recur in different parts of the movement. You can see that there's this section here after the letter F marked tranquillo, and then there's a section over here much later in the piece which is also marked tranquillo. And what you should make notice of is that they are actually the same, because it's the same kind of music that returns here. You can see that there's this quite unusual texture in the strings, and it's the same as the texture that we had over here. And therefore, when you come to a place like this, you should be aware of things like that, because even though this texture does not come in immediately when it says tranquillo, it is after all the same section which is about to begin. And this is the same tempo that goes into this place. So you shouldn't change the tempo. You shouldn't just pick any tranquillo tempo here and then go back into the tempo that you had over here. This tempo is actually the same. There's no transition from here to here. And therefore, even when you come to this place and you have this section here that starts out with this chord that goes into pianissimo, and there's the clarinet that continues and the harp that comes in, all of this is already in that same tempo as you had over here. This is a good example of something that you might be inclined to overlook, because when you say tranquillo, you just think, okay, I'll go down into a slower tempo. Yeah, but how much? Exactly this much. Then, when you have done all of this with the whole piece, in this case of the First Symphony of Sibelius with all 4 movements, you can start wondering also about what the connection between them is. Particularly, what kind of tempi should you choose? How fast should the slow movement be compared to the faster third movement and compared to the finale? What kind of relationship is there going to be between the movements? And you can also start noticing different motifs and how they appear either in a transformed way or in a direct way in other places of the symphony. The little motif in this particular symphony that appears at the beginning in the clarinet solo, how is that used again in the finale, and so on. Try to find out what the connections between the different movements are as well. Another thing that Panula talks about, which is very useful to know, is that the brain takes care of a lot of things by itself. It's very good to know that, because you can plan the way you're studying from that. So you can, for instance, as I've described, read through, look at some details, maybe play a bit and read through again, and then you leave the piece for a while, and then when you come back to it, you'll discover that something has already happened. Your understanding of it has grown while you were doing something else. It's very good to know that your subconscious mind takes care of a lot of things by itself. Because the best way to study is probably not to open a score and start studying all the details very thoroughly and work hard and work your way all the way through it. It seems to be much more effective to give your mind space to process things by itself. And that's what you do with this approach. And then later on, as you have gone through different processes, you can always study the details more and more and more and more closely, little by little. But it works best if you have space to think and to discover when you start. Something that you can begin to think about once you know the music fairly well is how much time are you going to spend rehearsing the different parts of it. So if something is more difficult, then you need to plan more time for it at the rehearsal, and if something is fairly easy, you can take less time. So you should look at how long every movement is, or maybe even how long every part of every movement is, and then how much time do you have at rehearsals, and then plan how much time you're going to spend doing each different thing. Then in the rehearsal situation, you might find out that you actually need more time to do something specific, but then you will know already how much less time you will then have for doing other things. It's very good to plan beforehand how the rehearsal is going to go, even if you end up changing it. Some of you may be inclined to think that it's a good idea to put all sorts of instructions and colors into a score and fill up the pages, and that's helpful. There are several reasons why that's not a good idea at all, and it is something that you should avoid as much as possible. It's better to keep things simple. You gotta ask yourself, what's the ideal for a conductor in terms of knowing the score? Well, the ideal is that you know the score so well that you don't even need it. You just come to the rehearsal and start conducting. So if you haven't memorized everything and you still need the score, then still, the better you know the piece, the more ideal. And if you feel the need to point out all sorts of things and write all sorts of things, then that's an indication that you do not know the music well enough. You're not internalizing music well enough if you feel the need to point out everything to yourself. And you're only giving yourself a false sense of security. Because if you go through a score and write something everywhere, then you give yourself the impression that you're preparing everything very well. But in fact, you're not internalizing it. And you're less likely to memorize it if you write something, because you rely on what you're writing instead of relying on what you're knowing. And also, information drowns when there's a lot of it. If you only put a few marks in a whole score, then when you go through it, you're very unlikely to miss those things. But if you put something everywhere, then you're also much more likely to miss out on things. So it's always better to memorize them. What exactly it is that you need to write in the score and how much is something that you will discover with experience. Little by little you will become aware of what you're likely to forget, where it is that you need to remind yourself of something. Things that it's generally good to mark out are things that are surprising. So if some passage comes back and it's different, or if you have some place where there's one fewer bar than there was before, then you could put a mark in the score so you won't miss that. Or if some passage comes back but it's in a different dynamic, that's also less obvious. You could miss it, so you put a mark to remind yourself. But at the same time, if you sit there with your pencil and you're ready to write something and you're thinking, oh yeah, this really is different than this other passage, then you already notice it, you're focusing on it, and then you might be able to remember it. Then you won't need to write anything. Little by little you will understand what it is that you need to point out, and it's very good to be aware of from the beginning of what it actually is that you could spare writing. How much could you leave out? How simple could you keep everything? Because if you take a score and you think, oh, here's the melody, so I put some color. It's like, don't you know already that that's the melody? Do you really know the music so poorly that you need to point out to yourself where the melody is? So, here is a little summary of the things that we have talked about. Thank you for watching. I hope that it gave you some useful new perspectives. Feel free to subscribe to the channel to stay updated. And you can also find Floridus Academy on Instagram and Facebook.